Hello, everyone, and welcome to our sixth lecture on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, today we shall be talking about the geographical implications in Shelley's Frankenstein, and today we shall move forward with other issues as well if we have the time, because I'll have to conclude these lectures uh, soon since your exams are coming up. So first, let me talk about the narrative frame of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Now, the full significance of the narrative frame of Frankenstein becomes clear if we go back to the early modern fantasies about the Terra Australis, that is the southern land, which located the existence of an earthly paradise in the polar regions. Now, with the progressive discovery of the Pacific, the theory became more and more untenable. Now, it lingered on a possibility into the 1770s when the British Navy demanded that James Cook's second journey of exploration between 1772 and 1775 should settle the matter once and for all of whether there was inhabitable land towards the southern pole. Now, when this fantasy was lost for the 18th century explorers, they came to locate earthly paradise in exotic islands like Tahiti and other places. Now, informed by a spirit of escapism, descriptions of the lush landscapes and erotic sensuality of the inhabitants elicited desires for passive abandonment to such balmy environments. Now, for those who embarked on the romantic quest for the self, however, the pleasurable conditions of Tahiti did not sufficiently challenge them to explore and expand their own limits. And the attempt to discover and experience the boundaries of what it meant to discover and experience the boundaries uh, of the new human found lands, which were more congenial in setting in the harsh weather of the polar regions, propelled the writers or the thinkers to probe into that once again. Now, it is an interesting coincidence that when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein, Adalbert von Chamisso, a prominent member of German Romanticism, was in the process of sailing around the world with the Romance of Expedition, which lasted for 1815 to 1818. And Chamisso was the author of Peter Schlemel in 1813, which was a widely influential tale about a pact maker with the devil who escapes damnation by traveling the world as a social outcast for the rest of his life. Now, Chamisso himself accompanied the Romance of Expedition in the role of botanist because he felt alienated by his contemporary society. Now, since it was the mission of the Romance of Expedition to find the Northeast Passage, he spent much time sailing around the Arctic seas. Now, it is very likely that the figure of the restless romantic poet turned botanic traveler inspired the narrative frame of Frankenstein. But of course, Walton's expedition is motivated by a much more ambitious goal. He is fired up by a powerful yearning to go further than anyone ever has done before him, so as to realize his wish to trade a land that was never before imprinted by the foot of man. He is prepared to leave behind all fear of danger and death. Now, Frankenstein begins with a series of letters by Robert Walton. and the captain of a naval expedition to the North Pole, to his sister in England. Now, his first letter explains that the objective of the expedition is to discover the tropical lands which are supposed to lie at the heart of the Arctic. And he writes, I try in vain to be persuaded that the pole is the seat of frost and desolation. It ever presents itself to my imagination as the region of beauty and delight. Now, much like Walton's expedition, James Cook, spent weeks battling against the ice and bitter cold before he declared the impossibility of any fruitful land lying further south. But the fact that Cook was sailing in the Resolution gives poignancy to the passage that describes Frankenstein's character while on board Walton's expedition. For instance, the text mentions, even the sailors feel the power of his eloquence. They believe these vast mountains of ice are molehills which will vanish before the resolution of man. Now, Cook's journey did not reach the pole end and hence did not really provide any conclusive evidence or data about the South Pole, and it failed to demonstrate the climatic inversions suggested by the myth. His detailed observations of the weather conditions, however, along with the hydrographic facts of the extreme south, were nevertheless considered an adequate basis for concluding that these extreme regions harbored no earthly paradise but an abode of ice. But the extreme circumstances give rise to the extreme behaviors as well. The physical backdrop of an impossible expedition sheds light on the motive behind Frankenstein's act of creation. And the story about Frankenstein's creation of an artificial human being is told while Walton continues to proceed north in the hope of realizing the burning desire to lead a glorious expedition. Now, the extraordinary nature of his ambition explains his bitter disappointment at what he calls the cowardice and indecision of his companions, which forced him to come back ignorant and disappointed. Now, although he ultimately is unable to ignore the reasoning of the crew that went along with him, Walton is scarcely moved by the fact that many of his comrades had already found a grave amid the scene of mass desolation. His own willingness to endure among the horrors of freezing to death shows that he does not simply aspire to achieve the goal at the expense of his own life. And over here, we have something which is very interesting, that a man might aspire at the utmost bounds of human extremes, as we have seen in Dr. Faustus, as we have seen in Tennyson's Ulysses, as we have seen in so many other texts. However, the practicality and the reality of the situation are what dawns over here on man, and therefore man cannot simply avoid them, and man cannot simply go on absolutely avoiding every single warning given by nature and still be victorious. I mean, that is not possible. And Walton realizes this. Now, since he embarks on a mission of transcending the limits of his ordinary humanity, he is also prepared to risk his physical survival. Now, it becomes painfully evident that the quest for the unconditional realization of the potentials embodied in his physical existence is a self destructive exercise. However, the novel does not argue that human striving has to necessarily be destructive, although we see the monster itself. Now, the novel establishes a close connection between the quest for knowledge and the act of striving after the absolute, and the wish to know and to explore the mysteries of life must be followed in order to reach a state of mature and responsible independence. And the loving dialogue between Sefi and Felix de Lacy, therefore, not only aims to achieve moral and emotional maturity, but also seeks to gain a living understanding of the mysteries of creation itself. The spirit is captured by the motto of Richard Lobb's book, The Contemplative Philosopher, one of the many scientific popularizations published in the early 19th century. Its frontispiece is accompanied by the phrase, by contemplating the works of creation, man rises to some faint idea of its great author. I'll repeat, by contemplating the works of creation, man rises to some faint idea of its great author. Now, as it is demonstrated by this epigraph, the yearning to grasp the secret rationale of creation featured as the mask of a noble soul. Now, Frankenstein, however, the text, however, examines the modalities of gratifying the desire to know the mysteries of creation itself. And let me quote a single passage which will uh, offer you a greater perspective into the legitimacy of scientific curiosity. If the study to which you apply yourself has a tendency to weaken your affections and to destroy your taste for those simple pleasures in which no alloy can possibly mix, then that study is certainly unlawful. That is to say, not befitting the human mind. Now, the healthy context for scientific inquiry is encapsulated in a caveat that adumbrates what should be the goal of study and exploration. The passage, therefore, proposes an ideal, a well balanced existence which demonstrates a useful store of knowledge about the self and the world, as well as a rich emotional life. Now, its attainment, it suggests, requires that straightforward striving for scientific facts might be replaced by an intelligent and informed engagement with those beings and objects which give rise to simple pleasures. Now, there is no attempt to condemn curiosity as such, but the novel certainly paints a gory picture of the consequences of such a desire, of such a striving, if it is not embedded in a nurturing context. For instance, let me just give you one example. When man for the first time was trying to create the atomic bomb out of the E is equal to mc square formula given by Albert Einstein, man was trying to create something great, but look at how it turned out. How the little boy and the fat man turned out. It wiped out from the face of the earth a portion of the humanity in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan. And when Robert P. Oppenheimer gave his opening speech regarding the atomic bomb, he said, "Behold, the world shall not be the same anymore." So you can understand the destructive capacities that have that the atomic bombs or that the creations of science possess. Yes, it is true that the nuclear power is being used in many good ways today, as well. But even before that, the atomic bomb caused the destruction, the mass destruction, and we cannot simply avoid that. Neither could the scientists, neither could the people who deployed the bomb. I mean, the Navy soldiers. A few years ago, I watched a documentary on Facebook where the soldiers, some of the remaining few soldiers who had actually been there at the dropping site of the bomb, many of them died in cancer, and the very few survivors who are still left, one of them gave the account that we were on sea, we were on water in boats, and when the bombs were deployed, we were asked to cover our heads and to cover our eyes. And when we shut our eyes, the explosion, the light and the heat was so great that when the explosion took place, we had shut our eyes, but still we could see the X ray pictures of the people in front of us. So, can you imagine how destructive and devilish it is? So, every product of science which does not have a nurturing quality and capacity and intent, whichever is not launched in the nurturing context, can be detrimental to humanity itself. Now, indictments of insufficient or inadequate education had also figured prominently in William Godwin's Caleb Williams, which was the most influential novel ever written by him. Now, there, the almost demonic power of the educator is expressed in an eloquent passage in which the main protagonist accuses his benefactor of irresponsible treatment, and the protagonist says, "You took me up, a raw and inexperienced boy capable of being molded to any form you pleased." So basically, he's asking, where is my opinion? And the narrative then goes on to illustrate that rather than forming this boy, the patron merely used him to gratify a whim and, in the process, warped his positive inclinations to divergent ends. And the scholarly focus on the creation of artificial life sadly overshadows Frankenstein's thematic focus on its characteristic psychological development of the characters themselves. Now, it is therefore all the more important to recognize that one of its prominent thematic strands deals with the growing and becoming of oneself. Now, growing and becoming has remained a major issue throughout the history of human civilization, throughout the history of human philosophy, especially Western philosophy, but in Eastern philosophy as well. But uh, becoming is perennially a very postmodern question, and Frankenstein can very well be read in the postmodern light of becoming, and especially Frankenstein can also be read in the post-humanist light of what is a human, of what is the monster. It can be read in the light of critical race theory, of the monster's yellow skin and the Mongolian impacts that were there. If I have time, I can have one lecture on this. Also, the monster can be read through disability studies, but these are something which are very advanced as uh, issues, and I do not really wish to bring them to the UG level and make the text unnecessarily complicated for you. So I'm just trying to give you a basic idea of Frankenstein. So let me try to do that to the best of my capability. Now, all the three narrators, Walton, Victor Frankenstein, and the creature, now they share a deep sense of loneliness, and all of them bitterly deplore their unsystematic and inadequate education. Walton begins his own story by saying my education was neglected, yet I was passionately fond of reading. The nature had generously equipped him with the intellectual faculties, but the development and direction of his talents was left to fate. There is a twinge of doubt about whether Mary is giving expression to her father's most cherished plans for enhancing social justice, or whether she might be indicting him for having insufficiently attended to her own growth and development. In any case, the terms by which the novel describes the significance of education recall Godwin's own writing in 1793, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice. There and in other analysis of society, Godwin founded his vision of social justice on an educational system that never ceases to cultivate the abilities and sympathies of an individual, proposing a method that embraces millions in its grasp and that educates in one school the preceptor and the pupil. So the teacher has to be educated, simultaneously, the student has to be educated. It's not just a one way process. Now, lack of suitable understanding and human sympathy is identified as the first cause for the tragic lives of all the three narrators of Frankenstein. Now, while emphatically eulogizing their loving family circle, each of those narrators reveal how they were thrown into the world without much guidance. And concerning his intellectual development, Victor Frankenstein describes himself as self taught. His criticism is meek and subdued, but he nevertheless indicts his father for his failure to guide his quest for his own identity and help him to figure out, to formulate, and to realize his aspirations. It is with a great deal of pain that Frankenstein remembers that his father fobbed him off with ridicule at a crucial stage of his development. We have mentioned this in the episode concerning young Frankenstein's reading of Cornelius Agrippa. Now, this is a major issue. Now, uh, we cannot but wonder whether it was in response to Victor's lament about his father's failure to rationalize his dismissive response that William Godwin wrote a book uh, which studied the lives of the necromancers in 1834. Now, the creature experiences an unparalleled isolation while going through the process of intellectual and emotional maturity. Now, his complete abandonment is a classic case of what Alice Miller describes as an emotional torture inflicted on children when adults deprive them of human interaction. The creature is nevertheless able to obtain a certain amount of knowledge through self education. His own Bildungsroman, therefore, Bildungsroman is a typical type of novel which follows the growth of a man from his childhood. If you read any of Dickens's novels, the major ones like David Copperfield, Nicholas Nickleby, um, Oliver Twist, all of these are in Bildungsroman format, where we see that a young child is growing up into maturity, into adulthood. So those are Bildungsroman novels. So the child's own Bildungsroman begins by recounting his responses to reading the most influential literary works of this period. But by doing so, he becomes a classic product of sensibility. However, tragically enough, he lacks the opportunity to realize his own emotional sensibility because his sensitivity is not reciprocated towards him, and therefore He has basically no idea that whether he is sensible, whether he is sensitive, or whether he makes sense in the first place. The novel portrays Walton's similarly melancholic quest for a soulmate, and it elaborates on Frankenstein's lonely brooding over the principle of life. Now, all three key protagonists or narrators are sensitive characters whose quest for meaning has set them apart from the rest of the society. We are not really told why Walton and Frankenstein are outsiders, but we receive the explanation that the creature's physical appearance excludes him from the social contract. He is not a man in the first place, and therefore he is not bound by the social contract. Now, if the three characters are read analogously, the gigantic stature of the creature can be interpreted as a literal marker for their shared metaphorical life and their differences as well, because regarding the nature and intensity of their intellectual powers and feelings, all of them are seen as larger than life. I mean, how many men dare to go to the Arctic, even today? So, this is a larger than life expedition. How many men dare to create a monster, even till today? It's a larger than life fact. How many monsters come alive and try to get hold of their creator? This is also a larger than life fact. So these three are basically larger than life characters, and we cannot absolutely deny any part of it. Now, uh, what happens over here is that, however, they differ strongly from the most influential literary figure with the overstrong feelings, Goethe's Werther. Unlike Werther, they refuse to pine away because they are different, and instead they seek to assert themselves through superhuman endeavors. Alright. Even they have a difference than Quasimodo, the Hunchback of Notre Dame. All these three characters have a difference than Quasimodo himself. Although in Quasimodo, in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, we see a parallel between the monster and the hunchback, because they are none of them are accepted by society because of their physical appearances. But the hunchback is still a man and still considered as a man, though an ugly man. And there, the question of the ugly, of how do we look at the ugly, that remains the question. But in general, over here, the monster does not pertain to humanity in the first place. And it would be very interesting if someone could actually draw a parallel between the Hunchback of Notre Dame and Frankenstein's monster. And there could be a brilliant discussion about a comparison and a contrast between Quasimodo and Frankenstein's monster, the unnamed monster. Now, all three main protagonists are also driven by an insatiable yearning to discover themselves. Now, owing to his obvious difference from all other beings, as I have said, the creature, the monster, is most intensely tortured with his attempt to puzzle out the secret of origin in general, not just his origin, but origin in general. And he says, I had never yet seen a being resembling me, or who claimed any intercourse with me. What was I? The question again recurred, to be answered only with groans. And again, the monster says, my person was hideous and my stature gigantic. What did this mean? Who was I? Whence did I come? What was my destination? These questions continuously recurred, but I was unable to solve them. Now, this is a major question that has perturbed the modernist writers, that has perturbed the Eastern metaphysicals, and many others. For instance, in the Kenopanishad, which is one of the major Upanishads of the East of ancient India, there is a question: Kene Shitang Patati, Kene Shitang. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the shlok. It basically, the shlok runs something like this. The translation: Kene Shitang Patati Prathamang Preshita Mana, or something like that. I'm forgetting the shlok. I have a very bad memory. It basically means that who first breathed life into us, who first gave us consciousness. And if you read the Upanishads, you'll find out that they ask the same question: Koham, Kenaham, Keshaham. Who am I? From whom am I? For whom am I? And these three same questions are asked by a modern painter, a modernist painter whose name is Paul Gauguin. Paul Gauguin painted a picture called Who Are We? Where do we come from? Where are we going? And look, these are the same questions that perturb the monster. So, therefore, the concerns, the considerations of literature do not change. The form of literature does not change, the content of literature does not change. It simply develops. The forms keep on developing. That is, they keep on becoming more and more and more intricate. If you read Virginia Woolf's modern novels or modern fiction, as it was later uh, translated into, there Woolf talks about how Jane Austen or Fielding created very brilliant novels out of very simple plot lines. But for the modernist writer or for the writer of today who is writing, say, you are starting a novel today, you cannot work with the same amount of simple material and create such a masterpiece. It's very difficult. So your own plot lines will have to be much more complex, much more intricate, and therein lies your capability. Therein lies your uh, novel success. Now, since we are asking this question, these questions rather, now we see that on an immediate level, the creature's situation is a typical problem of the early novel. Much like the heroes of Fielding's Tom Jones, as we have said, or Fanny Burney's Evelina, the creature seeks to find himself in the process of discovering his parents. On a deeper level, though, he is sharing Frankenstein's own desire to understand the essence of human nature. Now, what is the essence of human nature as seen by the monster or as seen by Mary Shelley? William Godwin's Caleb Williams explicitly circles around the question, what is man? Now, the influential role of the question is also documented by Mary Shelley's introduction of the 1831 version, where she explains that in the conversations between Lord Byron and her husband, various philosophical doctrines were discussed, and among others, the nature of the principle of life and whether there was any probability of its ever being discovered and communicated. The relevance of this passage for the emergence of the proto evolutionary theories has concentrated scholarly interest on the physiological dimension of the principles of life. The small circle of friends who had gathered around the Lake Geneva clearly discussed the opportunities and dangers afforded by the new medical biological discoveries and theories. However, they must also have devoted themselves to a philosophical explanation of the issue at hand. That is the fundamental characteristics of humankind. Now, in order to make progress in these explorations, it was necessary to risk encountering truths that would profoundly affect the human understanding of the self and the world. Now, such a moment informs Frankenstein's first meeting with Professor Waldman. His lectures, his lectures in chemistry at Ingolstadt. Now, his first letter, no, in the subsequent attempts, rather, to identify the sources of his misfortunes, Frankenstein argues that Waldman carelessly enkindled his new students' enthusiasm for the work of the modern masters, who, although their hands seem only made to dabble in dirt and their eyes to pore over the microscope or the crucible, have indeed performed miracles. They penetrate into the recesses of nature and show how she works in her hiding places. Now, the phrase hiding places is reminiscent of Francis Bacon's preface to the Great Instauration of 1620, where he ridicules the complaints by less lucid thinkers who turn to complaints about the subtlety of nature, the hidden recesses of truth, the obscurity of things. In spite of aiming for order and clarity, he also cannot escape the bafflement of lesser lights at different places of scientific discovery. And basically, what we see is that in the Frankenstein, there are several scientific views or visions which are available. For instance, Waldman's arrogant view that science can and should penetrate into the secret places of nature, regardless whether an act of violence is committed on nature itself, supplies a purpose for the hitherto aimless young student, Frankenstein. Now, the metaphor of penetrating nature channels his masculine energies and gives birth to his deadly ambition. In retrospect, Frankenstein bitterly complains about his professor's disregard for the consequences of the knowledge passed on to innocent young students who are not yet capable of weighing the consequences of their own studies. The 1831 version, however, shifts the emphasis from Waldman's irresponsibility to the fatalistic sense that Frankenstein was at the mercy of fate, that he conspired to crush himself. Such were the professor's words, rather, let me say, such the words of fate announced to destroy me. Now, this is very interesting that how the focuses keep on shifting. But then you see the critics have moved on to a very different direction, and they have asked whether Frankenstein is a cautionary tale about the misappropriation of science. Now, I personally do not adhere to any moralistic implications given by a text because each age, each country has its own moral codes, and reading an 1818 or an 1831 text in the 2000s, in the second decade of 2000s, we cannot apply the same moral codes for ourselves, right? For instance, if Frankenstein is a cautionary tale that you should not dabble in sciences which you do not understand, or you should not dabble in sciences which can be detrimental, if that was the case, then we would not have the nuclear weapons, we could not have the many of the medicines which were created by accident today. We would not have Frankenstein, we would not have Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and many such brilliant tales. And most of all, we would not have a monster called the smartphone. We would not have. Because who imagined that the telephone, which was meant for communication, would come in so handy in a very literal sense. Also, imagine, I was thinking about it last night. I don't know if you'll agree with me or not. I mean, with the present day obsession with the stealth of data, with the stealth of information, it has become a very important issue with us, because so many sites, starting from news portals to many sites that we visit, they use cookies, which are basically permissions that we give them to monitor our data. And based on those things, these sites provide us with articles or different issues that we need. For instance, go to Facebook or go to WhatsApp, talk to your friend about something that you want to buy, and then just within an hour go to Amazon or Flipkart, and you will suddenly see there is a very high chance that you are seeing ads of that same product that you were thinking about. So you can already understand that how we are being monitored. So if Frankenstein is a cautionary tale, you can take it as a cautionary tale. If you think that the morals of a time do not apply to another, that is, morals are not universal, then don't apply any morals to Frankenstein. Now, therefore, for me, Frankenstein is a very interesting text, and I would love to keep it at there, because any further discussions would only complicate the text for you. I have addressed many of the major issues, and I think this should cover for your examination. If there are any other issues that you want me to discuss, put them in the comment section, and I'll have maybe one more lecture on them. I do not want to get into the race issue, because that's a very complex thing. But if you really want, and there are other issues as well, so think about them and let me know, and I'll try to comply. So thank you. Have a good day.